The wind that night sounded like a wounded creature, crying against the frozen ribs of the valley. Snow came sideways, a pale fury swallowing the hills, and the world seemed to have forgotten color. Evelyn Harper swung her axe against a log outside the cabin, each strike ringing sharp as a church bell in the storm. She'd been chopping since noon, not from need. There was already enough wood stacked by the wall, but to keep from thinking. Her breath came in white bursts. Her fingers, raw and trembling, gripped the haft until it felt like part of her bones. Inside the cabin, the fire snapped and muttered, lonely as she was. A kettle hissed on the stove, its small cloud of steam rising like a prayer she couldn't form. She stopped to listen. Nothing but the scream of wind and the slow settling of snow. Her husband had once called this kind of weather God's silence. Now, alone a full year since the fever took him, she had come to fear that silence more than sin itself. Then came the sound. Barely there at first, like an animal dragging a wounded leg through the drifts. She lifted her head, the axe slipping from her numb hands. Again, a crunch. A groan. Her heart jerked like a startled bird. In the white veil of snow beyond the fence, something moved. Massive, swaying, human. She reached for the rifle by the door, thumbed back the hammer, and waited. Through the wall of wind came a shape. A giant of a man, bare to the waist under a torn coat, his skin copper-brown and bleeding, one arm hanging useless against his side. His breath came in gasps that smoked like the furnace of the earth. He took 2 steps closer and collapsed, knees first, then forward into the snow. Evelyn froze. The rifle felt too heavy. The man's face was turned half to the light, long hair black and matted with snow, high cheekbones, lashes rimmed with frost. An Apache. Her mind filled with the stories told in hushed voices around town fires. Raiders, scalp hunters, burned farms. She should have shut the door, bolted it, prayed. But his chest was still moving, barely. The storm roared like judgment. Her feet moved before her thoughts could follow. She crossed the yard, boots sinking deep, snow stinging her cheeks. She knelt beside him. His skin burned with fever under the cold. Blood had soaked through the torn wool at his shoulder and frozen to his chest in a dark sheen. He opened his eyes for a moment. Dark, searching, almost childlike. His lips parted and she heard him whisper, hoarse and broken. "I lost my family today. Can I spend the night with you?" The rifle slipped from her hands and sank into the snow. She stood there, breath caught in her throat. The words were English, but heavy with an accent that turned each syllable into something fragile. She looked toward the cabin, the faint orange flicker through the window. Inside there was warmth, safety, the illusion of control. Out here was danger, and a man the town would say should be left to die. Her body trembled, not from cold. Somewhere deep inside her chest, grief answered grief. "Just one night," she said softly, not sure if she was speaking to him or to herself. He didn't move when she tugged at his good arm. He was far too heavy. She fetched a rope, looped it under his shoulders, and dragged him inch by inch toward the porch, snow spilling over her boots and down her collar. By the time she pulled him inside, her lungs were burning, and tears had frozen to her lashes. The cabin door shut with a heavy thud, muting the storm to a low, angry moan. She pushed the bolt in place, then leaned against the wood, catching her breath. The man lay sprawled on her floorboards, leaving a dark trail of melted snow and blood. Steam rose from his body in the firelight. His chest heaved shallowly, ribs sharp under the skin. "Lord, forgive me," she whispered and knelt beside him. She cut the remnants of his coat away, revealing a splintered mess of muscle and torn flesh at the shoulder. The arm, God, the arm, hung wrong, the bone broken clean through under the skin. She'd seen that look once before, when her husband fell from the horse during the last winter drive. She had wrapped his arm the same way then, with linen torn from her own dress. He had smiled at her through the pain. That smile had been the last thing she remembered before the fever took him. Now she worked in silence, the rhythm of her hands steadier than her heartbeat. She boiled water, tore bandages, cleaned the wound. Each time her fingers brushed his skin, a shiver ran through her. Not fear now, but some strange recognition. His body was heat itself, wild and human and alive. When she poured whiskey on the wound, He gritted his teeth and gave a sound between a growl and a prayer. His eyes opened again, dark as wet earth. "You're alone," he murmured. She hesitated. "Yes." He nodded once, slow, then shut his eyes again as if that knowledge eased him. The wind struck the cabin like a drum. Shadows flickered across the logs, bending and stretching with the fire. Evelyn sat on the floor beside him, knees drawn to her chest, and stared at the flames until they blurred. She thought of the neighbors, Mrs. Calloway especially, what they'd say if they knew she'd dragged an Apache into her home. They'd call her lost, maybe worse. They'd say mercy was the beginning of sin. But watching him breathe, she couldn't bring herself to regret it. He stirred again near midnight, muttering something in his own tongue, low and melodic. His good hand moved toward the firelight as if chasing warmth. For a moment, his fingers brushed hers where they rested on the floor. She pulled away sharply, but his hand fell limp before she could move farther. She watched him, listening to the slow rise and fall of his chest. Outside, the wind howled and scraped across the roof. A wolf's cry rose from the timberline, long and mournful. Evelyn stood and laid another log on the fire, the orange light washing her face in gold. In that glow, she almost looked peaceful. She fetched a blanket, her husband's old one, patched and frayed, and spread it over the man. When she tucked the corners beneath his shoulders, he whispered something again. She leaned closer to catch it. "Thank you," he said, the words fragile as smoke. Her throat tightened. "Sleep," she murmured. The kettle hissed again on the stove. She poured herself a cup of tea, but her hands shook so badly she spilled half of it. She sat at the table, staring at the door, wondering if she'd lost her mind, or found it. Hours passed. The storm pressed against the cabin like a living thing. Every creak of the wood sounded like footsteps. Every shift of wind felt like breath on her neck. She thought of her husband's grave behind the barn, now buried under snow. She thought of how grief had hollowed her, how silence had become her only companion. And she wondered if maybe, just maybe, mercy was not madness but survival. Near dawn, the storm's fury dulled to a soft, endless drift. The fire had sunk low, glowing red. Evelyn rose to check on the man. His fever had eased, his breathing deepened. She brushed a strand of hair from his forehead, surprised by her own tenderness. The scar running along his jaw caught the light, beautiful in its ugliness. She turned toward the window. The sky beyond was a pale gray, the kind of color that promised nothing. Somewhere in the distance, a horse neighed, no wild sound, but domestic. Her pulse quickened. Riders. She looked back at the stranger on her floor. The town would never understand this mercy. They'd see only what they wanted, a widow sheltering the enemy. Her mouth went dry. She lifted the rifle from the corner and checked the chamber. Then she blew out the lanterns one by one until only the fire remained. The man stirred, eyes opening slowly. He looked at her from where he lay. Pain, shame, and gratitude tangled in that gaze. "If they come," he said quietly, "I will go." Evelyn held his eyes for a long moment. Snowlight crept through the cracks in the window, cold and silver. She set the rifle down again and whispered, "Not tonight." Outside, hooves drew nearer. The first knock came, hard and hollow, echoing through the cabin walls. Evelyn's breath caught as she glanced at the wounded man lying in the firelight. His good hand reached slowly for the knife at his belt, his face unreadable. The door shuddered under another knock, louder this time. She whispered, barely audible, "Don't move." Then the latch lifted. The second knock thundered like a shot. Evelyn froze beside the fire, her breath trembling in her throat. The stranger, Tahu, she'd heard him whisper that name in fever, pushed himself upright with his good arm. His other hung limp, tied in her linen. The firelight painted the sharp lines of his chest, the scars like pale rivers across bronze skin. He was too weak to stand, but pride flickered in his eyes, old and unbroken. Outside, a man's voice barked through the wind. "Evelyn Harper. Open the door." Her pulse thudded in her ears. Deputy Miles Turner, she'd know that voice anywhere. The sound of his boots crunching on snow brought the weight of judgment with it. She glanced at Tahu, whose fingers brushed the knife at his belt again. "Don't," she whispered. "He'll kill you where you stand." Tahu's dark gaze met hers. "Then I die standing." "Please." Her voice cracked. "Stay still. Let me talk." The latch lifted once more, rattling against her grip. She forced herself to breathe, then called out, "Storm's bad, deputy. Can it wait till morning?" A pause, then the scrape of a hand across the door. "We saw tracks, Evelyn. Blood. You harborin' someone." The lie came easy and tasted of iron. "A wounded horse wandered in. That's all." Silence stretched. She could almost hear the man thinking on the other side of the wood. Then, "Open the door, ma'am." Her hand trembled on the latch. Behind her, Tahu was a shadow against the wall, eyes half closed, chest rising shallow. She whispered, "Stay down." Then she opened the door just enough for the wind to claw its way in. Miles stood there with two men from town, snow crusting their hats and shoulders. His face was red from cold and suspicion. "Evenin', ma'am," he said, tipping his hat with a stiffness that wasn't courtesy. "Mind if we come in?" She hesitated, letting the wind whip her shawl against her cheek. "You'll let all the heat out." He leaned closer. "Best to be sure there ain't something worse gettin' in." She stepped aside before her heart could betray her face. The men stomped their boots, their eyes wandering across the small cabin. The bed neatly made, the table with 2 mugs of tea, the rifle near the wall. Miles sniffed. "You alone here?" Evelyn nodded. "I told you, just me." The deputy's eyes narrowed. He glanced toward the far corner where a blanket lay rumpled near the fire. For a heartbeat, she thought he saw movement, but it was only the play of flame. He frowned. "Strange. Doc Sam found tracks lead in this way. Bare feet. Big ones." Evelyn's hands curled in her skirt. "Maybe a drifter passed through before the storm." "Maybe." His gaze lingered on her face longer than comfort allowed. "You sure you're safe out here all alone?" She swallowed. "Been safe a whole year now." Miles nodded slowly. "Still, wouldn't hurt to stay in town till spring. Folks get mighty strange out here when the snow starts whisperin'." "I'll manage," she said quietly. He sighed, turned to leave, and stopped near the door. "If you see anyone that don't belong, you send word. We can't risk trouble. Not after what happened near Fort Grant." "I will," she lied. When the door closed and their footsteps faded, she sagged against the wall. The cabin felt smaller now, as if the air itself had been accused. Tahu stirred. "You protect me," he said softly. She turned, startled. "I protected myself. They'd have burned my cabin if they knew." He nodded once, accepting the truth without shame. His eyes drifted to the window, where frost had grown in patterns like feathers. "They hate my kind. You hate us too." Evelyn hesitated. "I was taught to." He looked back at her, waiting. She set her jaw. "But I'm learnin' I was taught wrong." Something flickered in his eyes. Pain, disbelief, maybe gratitude. He shifted, wincing as he adjusted his shoulder. "Your husband?" he asked quietly. The name caught like a thorn in her throat. "John," she murmured. "Fever took him last winter. He used to say kindness was a fool's gamble." Tahu's gaze softened. Maybe he was right. She half smiled. Maybe. But sometimes a fool lives longer than a soldier. The silence that followed wasn't heavy, it was fragile. She could hear the crackle of sap bursting in the fire, the soft sigh of the wind easing outside. She poured the remaining tea into a mug and handed it to him. His large fingers brushed hers when he took it. His hand was calloused, the skin rough but warm. He drank slowly, then said, "My family gone." She lowered herself beside him, the floorboards creaking. "You said that." He stared into the fire. "Soldiers came at dawn. They took my wife. My sons tried to fight. One was 8. His voice thinned, like breath over glass. "Snow covered them before I could." The tea trembled in her hands. "I'm sorry." He gave a short nod, not accepting pity, but acknowledging her humanity. You have no fear of me? She looked at him, truly looked. The torn muscle, the hollow eyes, the remnants of war carved into his flesh. If you meant me harm, I'd be gone already. That earned the faintest ghost of a smile. For a long time they sat like that, two broken things watching the fire mend itself. By morning, the storm had spent its rage. Sunlight seeped through the frost, soft as milk. Evelyn opened the door, and cold air washed through the room. Outside lay silence, the world reborn in white. Tahu sat near the hearth, carving something small from a scrap of pine with his good hand. You should rest, she said. He didn't look up. My arm is weak. But hands remember. She stepped closer. What are you making? He turned it slightly, a small bird, unfinished but graceful. To thank you. You don't have to. I know. His eyes lifted to hers. That's why I must. The words struck something deep in her. She turned away quickly, pretending to stir the fire. You'll leave when the trail's clear, I suppose. He nodded. If I stay, they come for you. They'll come anyway, she whispered. Her voice trembled enough that he looked at her again. You fear them more than me? I fear being the thing they whisper about, she said. The widow who lost her faith, her decency. I fear waking up to find they were right. He studied her, then said, You have more courage than they ever will. The words startled her, gentle, unpolished, true. No man had spoken to her like that since John was alive. She wanted to tell him not to say such things, but instead she found herself whispering, You don't even know me. His eyes didn't waver. I know mercy when it burns. The fire popped, scattering sparks between them. Her breath caught. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to the space of that flame. Then the sound of hooves shattered the stillness. She went to the window and saw 3 riders in the distance, small against the white plain. The sun caught the glint of their rifles. They're coming back, she said, voice thin. Tahu rose, wincing, gripping the wall for balance. Then I go. She turned sharply. You can barely stand. He took a step toward the door, blood seeping through the bandage anew. Better die outside than make you die inside. She grabbed his arm, his good one, and for the first time, her voice broke completely. Don't you dare walk into that snow again. He stopped, breathing hard, their faces inches apart. His eyes were full of that same quiet pride, that same grief. Outside, the riders drew nearer. Snow lifted behind them like ghosts. Evelyn's fingers tightened on his arm. If they see you, they'll hang us both. Then you must choose, he whispered. She did not let go. The sound of the horses filled the air, closer and closer, until the windows rattled. Evelyn met his gaze, her voice a whisper lost to the wind. Then we'll face them together. And somewhere beyond the ridge, a rifle cracked. The rifle crack split the quiet like a scream. Evelyn flinched as a splinter of wood burst from the doorframe beside her. Smoke curled through the air, thin, blue, terrifyingly calm. Outside, men shouted her name. She turned to Tahu. He stood braced against the wall, his face carved in shadow, his good hand clutching the knife. His injured arm hung bound in her linen, blood seeping dark through the cloth. Stay down, she hissed. He didn't. He moved to the window, limping, his bare chest rising and falling like a storm contained. The snow beyond was blinding, and she could see them now. 3 riders from town, rifles raised, their horses half buried in white. Deputy Miles at the front, his hat low, his expression a sermon of law and fury. Evelyn's heart pounded like the fire itself. They'll kill you, she said. Tahu looked back at her, his voice rough but steady. Then you tell them I came to die. I can't. The words shook. They won't listen. He met her eyes. Then you must make them. Before she could speak again, another shot rang out. The window shattered, scattering frost and glass like rain. Evelyn cried out, ducking behind the table. The storm outside swallowed the echoes. Evelyn Harper. Miles' voice carried across the field. Step outside. You've got one chance before we burn your home to the ground. She closed her eyes. The smell of smoke, memory and fear, rose in her throat. She saw it again. Her husband, coughing blood as their old cabin burned when soldiers mistook their light for an Apache signal. The snow that night had looked just like this. When she opened her eyes, something fierce had replaced her fear. She grabbed her shawl, pulled it tight around her shoulders, and went to the door. "Stay inside," she told Tahu. He shook his head once. "If you walk into their fire, I walk with you. You can't fight them with one arm." "I can die on my feet," he said quietly. She didn't answer. The latch lifted. The storm had slowed to a ghost's breath, snow drifting soft, endless. The air was sharp enough to draw tears. She stepped out onto the porch, rifle slung loosely in her hands but barrel down. Her boots sank deep into the powder. The three men rode closer, the horse's breath steaming. Miles raised his rifle. "Where is he, Evelyn?" She didn't flinch. "Inside." "Then step aside." "No." He blinked, as if he hadn't heard her. "You know what he is." "I know he's a man who's lost everything." Miles spat into the snow. "He's a murderer." "And what are we, Miles?" She asked softly. "How many bodies buried before you learned to speak their language?" His jaw tightened. The other two men shifted uneasily, rifles still ready. Evelyn's voice carried clear through the still air. "He's wounded. He'll leave when the weather clears. You burn this cabin, you burn me too." Miles' horse stamped the ground, impatient. "You lost your mind, Harper? They'll say you've taken up with him." "Let them," she said. "It won't be the first time this town's lied about me." A ripple of silence passed between them. Somewhere behind her, the cabin door creaked open. She turned just in time to see Tahu step out into the snow, bare-chested, towering, the storm framing him like a spirit from the old stories. His breath steamed in the cold, eyes hard as flint. One of the riders cursed and raised his gun. Evelyn moved without thought, stepping between them. "Don't!" she shouted. Miles hesitated, eyes flicking between them. The silence stretched taut. Tahu stood still, blood seeping from his shoulder, his body trembling but unyielding. Finally, Miles lowered his rifle a fraction. "He leaves by sundown," he said flatly. "You let him stay past that, and I'll bring the whole town." Evelyn nodded once, the sound caught in her throat. The men turned their horses, their silhouettes fading into white. When the last hoofbeat disappeared, she turned to Tahu. "You shouldn't have come out," she said. "You shouldn't have stood there." She almost laughed, but the sound died in her chest. "They'll come back." He nodded. "Then I will go before night." She looked at him, his arm trembling, lips blue from the cold, and something inside her rebelled. "You won't make it 2 miles. Then I will die close to your fire." The quiet that followed was unbearable. She turned back toward the cabin, her steps heavy. Inside, the warmth hit her like a wave. She shut the door, pressed her back to it, and closed her eyes. When she opened them again, Tahu was beside her, silent. He sank to the floor, breathing shallowly, exhaustion weighing him down. She fetched water, knelt, and cleaned his wound again. Her hands were steady, though her eyes burned. "You should hate me," he said after a long while. "I did," she whispered. "But hate's too heavy to carry through winter." He watched her fingers wrap the bandage tight. "You are alone too long," he murmured. She looked at him, startled by the tenderness in the words. "And you think you aren't?" He gave the smallest shake of his head. "My people say the wind remembers names. When I die, it will carry mine to my sons. But you, who will remember you?" The question struck deep. She turned away, staring into the fire. "No one," she said softly. "Maybe the house, maybe the snow." He studied her face, the hollows of her eyes, the way she tried to hide behind strength. "Then let the wind remember both." Something fragile passed between them, an understanding that needed no language. She poured him tea, her fingers brushing his when she handed it over. For once, she didn't pull away. Outside, the sky dimmed. Shadows moved across the snow, long and blue. The storm had ended, but the cold had teeth. Evelyn stood by the window, watching the world fade. "They'll come again tomorrow," she said. "They'll bring more." Tahu sipped his tea, gaze distant. "Then I leave before dawn." She turned sharply. "You can't even lift your arm." His expression didn't change. "If I stay, you die. If I go, I die slower. I prefer the long way." The simplicity of it hurt more than the words. She wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but the truth was heavier than both of them. "Why did you come here?" she asked suddenly. He looked at the fire. "Because the snow doesn't ask what I am." The answer hollowed her. She sank onto the chair across from him, her voice barely a whisper. "And now you've found someone who doesn't either." His gaze lifted slowly, meeting hers. The room was quiet except for the steady rhythm of the fire. For the first time since her husband's death, Evelyn felt the ache inside her soften, not vanish, but change shape. There was grief still, but also something like peace, faint as the smell of pine smoke. He said quietly, "You gave me shelter. I have nothing to give." "You gave me something to remember," she said. They sat there as darkness took the last light from the window. The world outside disappeared into blackness. Tahu shifted, wincing, trying to rise. "I go now." She reached out, placing a hand on his chest. "Not yet," she said. Her fingers lingered longer than she meant them to. His heartbeat was steady, slow, alive. He looked down at her hand, then at her. "If I stay till morning," he said softly, "the fire will see what it costs." "Then let it," she whispered. Outside, the wind began to rise again, restless, circling the cabin. The sound was no longer mournful, it was warning. The first hint of new snow brushed against the windowpane like fingertips. Evelyn turned her face toward the storm, her hand still resting against his chest, and said in a voice barely audible, "If they come for you, they'll have to walk through me first." And somewhere out in that endless white, a lantern flickered, a distant glow moving toward the cabin, steady and slow as fate itself. The lantern outside moved closer, its light trembling through the snow like a dying star. Evelyn stood still, her hand pressed to the wooden door, heart drumming against her ribs. Beside her, Tahu rose slowly, his body a map of exhaustion and scars, his broken arm bound tight but useless. The fire behind them threw long, flickering shadows across the walls, their figures merging and separating in the glow. "They're coming," she whispered. He nodded. "I know." "Maybe it's Miles again," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. He looked toward the window, where the light glowed faintly through the frost. "Maybe not." The wind howled harder now, flinging snow against the panes. She could barely make out the silhouette of a man dismounting. Another shape followed, a second lantern. Her breath caught. "There's more than one." Tahu reached for the knife at his belt, his fingers trembling. She caught his wrist. "You can't fight them all." He met her eyes. "If I fall, they won't touch you." The words hit her like a blow. "Don't you dare die for me." He gave the faintest smile, sad, tender, weary. "Then for what else is there left?" Before she could speak, a heavy fist pounded on the door. "Evelyn Harper. You've been warned." It was Miles' voice, but harder now, sharpened by fear and pride. "The town's decided. We can't risk an Apache camp near these woods. Hand him over." Evelyn's throat tightened. "There is no camp," she shouted back. "He's one man." "That's one too many," came the reply. The fire hissed, sparks rising like frantic fireflies. Tahu stepped closer to the door. "Let me go," he murmured. "If I leave, they live with their lie. If I stay, they'll burn this house with you in it." She shook her head. "You won't last an hour in that storm." "Then it is a good death," he said softly. She looked at him, really looked. The way the light painted his face in gold and shadow, the streaks of dried blood along his arm, the quiet dignity of a man who had already buried everything he loved. Something inside her broke. "No," she said, voice trembling but clear. "I won't lose another soul to snow." He tried to move past her, but she stepped in front of him, blocking the door. The pounding came again. "Last warning." Miles shouted. Evelyn's eyes burned. You listen to me, she said, her voice low and fierce. I don't care what happens out there. Inside this house, you're not their enemy. You're mine to protect. Tahu's breath caught, and for the first time, his composure faltered. You shame yourself, he whispered. She shook her head. I'm saving what's left of me. The silence that followed was unbearable. Then he reached up with his good hand, fingers brushing her jaw, a touch so careful it felt like prayer. Then I will stand beside you, he said. When she opened the door, the storm roared in like an animal freed. Snow whipped around them, turning the lantern light into halos. Miles and 4 men stood outside, rifles glinting under the moon's pale veil. Evelyn stepped forward, her shawl snapping in the wind. Put your guns down, she called out. Miles' eyes narrowed. You've lost your mind. No, she said. Just my fear. Tahu stepped out behind her, the firelight spilling over his shoulders, steam rising from his skin. The sight of him made one of the men flinch and lift his rifle. Miles barked, Don't shoot. But the wind stole his command. A shot cracked. The sound was deafening. Evelyn gasped, spinning toward Tahu. The bullet had grazed his side. Blood bloomed against the snow like spilled wine. He didn't fall. He only staggered forward, one hand pressed to the wound. Miles swore, stepping between his men. Enough. God help you, enough. But Tahu kept walking, slow and steady, until he stood a few feet from them. I came here for warmth, he said, his voice carrying like thunder muffled by distance. Not war. Miles hesitated, his breath clouding the air. You've brought it all the same. Then let it end here, Tahu said. Kill me, and tell your children it was mercy. The wind swallowed the space between them. No one moved. Evelyn's chest heaved. Miles, she pleaded. You've known me since I was a girl. Look at him. Does he look like a threat to anyone but the cold? Miles' eyes flicked from her to the man before him. The barrel of his rifle lowered an inch. The storm moaned around them like an old grief coming undone. Behind him, one of the men, young, nervous, shifted his horse. You're gonna regret this, deputy, he muttered. Town'll say you've gone soft. Miles turned his head slowly. Maybe softness is what we've all been missing. He stepped forward, pulling his coat tight. You've got until dawn, he said to Evelyn, not unkindly. After that, I can't protect either of you. She nodded, tears freezing on her cheeks. That's all we need. The men rode off into the white, their shapes fading like ghosts. The storm eased with them, as if tired of its own fury. Evelyn turned to Tahu. His knees buckled. She caught him before he hit the ground. Easy, she whispered. You're safe. He smiled faintly, eyes half closed. You speak like wind woman, he murmured, his words slurring. Soft, but strong. Quiet now, she said, dragging him inside. She laid him near the fire, his blood dark against the floorboards. The wound wasn't deep, but the cold had stolen too much from him already. She pressed her palm to his chest. Stay with me, she whispered. He looked at her, lids heavy. Why? Because I've buried enough ghosts. The fire burned low, painting the walls in trembling gold. Outside, dawn began its slow climb through the storm, turning the world silver. Evelyn worked in silence, cleaning his wound, wrapping it tight. Her fingers trembled, not from fear this time, but from something heavier, something that felt dangerously like hope. Hours passed. When she finally looked up, the first light of morning slipped through the window. Snow glittered like ground glass. Tahu stirred, his voice barely audible. It is morning. She nodded. You're still here. He gave a weak smile. Then perhaps your house is stronger than the world. She laughed softly, a sound that broke like thawing ice. Or maybe I am. He watched her for a long time. You have fire in you, he said. Enough for 2 lifetimes. Her throat tightened. Then don't make me spend it alone. For a moment, silence filled the room. The kind that means everything's been said without a word. The fire cracked softly, throwing sparks upward. Tahu reached for her hand. His grip was faint, but it held. "When snow melts," he said, "I build your roof again. My arm will learn strength." She smiled, tears glimmering in the light. "And I'll keep the fire ready." Outside, the world began to breathe again. The wind softened to a sigh. The storm had broken. Evelyn stood, pulling the blanket higher over his shoulders. She turned toward the window, watching as sunlight touched the endless white. Behind her, his voice came low, steady, almost like prayer. "You saved my life, woman of the storm." She looked back, her face calm, eyes bright with something unspoken. "No," she whispered. "You gave mine back." The camera would pull wide here. The ruined cabin, the smoke curling upward, two souls framed in a world reborn. The wind carried the scent of pine and ash, the quiet promise of spring buried beneath snow. And in that stillness her voice, soft, reflective, eternal, seemed to echo through the years. "If mercy is weakness, then let it be the kind that saves us all."